it's a fascinating question, a subject for a documentary, and it was known about for years in New Orleans that it was part of a collection, but that's all anyone seemed to know, is that there was an Alfred Medley collection that this guy had stamped a bunch of books with his name on it, but no one knew who Alfred Medley was.
They would sell parts of the collection at different times, and that's why you only see him in New Orleans, because he was from New Orleans. It was all his first appearances, but the stamp was always everywhere in the same spot. And I always thought he would pick the spot that actually had the least amount of characters and most open area.
I mean, I've heard some of the stories about him through other people. I found the stamp on the book, and I remember asking Carl about it, and I was like, he's like, people have asked me about that. He's like, I don't think I've ever met the guy, but I think he puts his stamp on it because he's like trying to market that it's his, and he's like kids do.
Because it was a kid that was doing this in the 60s, because they were all bought, looked like right off the stands. It wasn't like an adult later on going on, I'm stamping all my books. When I worked for AG, he got a collection, and it had 3 or 4 issues that were stamped. I was like, oh, look, another Alfred Medley book. He's like, oh yeah, Arthur was a Tripp. I'm like, oh, so you knew him? He goes, nobody really knew him. He said, but he would always just show up, and he would have key books, and he was a good negotiator. It was also a brother. The brother would go with the father, because everything I ever got out of whenever they would do, it was like strict negotiations. They knew the worth, they knew the value, which back then, I mean, Overstreet was still kind of in its infancy stage. I mean, Overstreet started in 75. Unless you had a copy of that book you were going to, they knew grades, they knew everything. So they were shrewd. They were going to get their money's worth of whatever they were doing trying to sell it. So the dad was pretty smart if that was the dad that was doing it.
I remember the stamp. I remember seeing that stamp, and I've seen it on several books between there and like BSI. Some guy that did this to all of his comic books. I thought maybe it was a library stamp or something.
I've always wondered if Alfred Medley was a real person. Most of the stamps that I ever saw were for stores.
It is a store stamp, and it's from right up around, I'd say, between Nashville and Virginia. The Alfred Medley, when the story went for us, there was an old department store, and when we'd come across them, they'd make us think like they were holy grail.
Yeah.
And the only problem was it was no more than a gimmick. And that later on, why he would stamp them thinking he'd get away with it was because, remember, all the stores would take their stamp the comics, which does not hurt tonight. The story, like I said, that I'd heard before I'd talked to you was there was a store that was called Alfred Medley's, which was a variety store, sort of your mom and pop traded shop. Like you'd take a dozen eggs, take home flour. And he would stamp it on there, and the kids, this is actually the way the story was told to me, he had it stamped on there, so when the kids took the books home and read them, if they wanted to come back, if they had it stamped, they could trade them back in.
But I really want to know how and why Alfred Medley's collection made it out into the world. Because you asked me if I knew who Alfred Medley was. I said, coincidentally, I do actually know who Alfred Medley was. I've always kind of had a little bit of a, thing in the back of my head of who the hell is this guy? Because I had 2 comics that I thought was a store.
I don't remember Alfred personally. I thought maybe that's who it was, but I didn't know. I was probably all of 12, 13 years old, was in the store when Kirby and Carl were buying a few books. We're talking key issues, Marvel, for the most part that I remember. The argument ensued of whether or not the stamped name affected the condition of the book.
Something is stamped on it, it's ruined.
Wouldn't this devalue the book? And Carl's like, it's in the dollar rack. It's not that valuable to begin with.
I got all the Alfred Medley comic books that I got from the shop. And the reason I have them is because we couldn't really sell them. Comic books with somebody's name stamped on the front of them are not as collectible. And several of them had holes punched in the spine, which makes them virtually worthless. So we could not sell those books. So we were always sort of joking with Sheldon, like, why did you buy these goddamn things? It's just like, we can't sell them. And they became like a joke, like when we would find one in the pile someplace, Richard or I would say like, oh, from the Medley collection.
How much is it selling for?
It sold for $900. Actually, I didn't want to sell it, and I said $900 when it was really worth about $7, and dude just bought it anyway. So maybe it was because of the stamp. So all you people out there, buy it because of the Medley stamp. There you go.
Kirby G and John Fontaine, which is another complete derelict, were sitting around talking about collections, and the name Alfred Medley came up somehow. And at the time, they were doing a show called Pelicon, and they were trying to get all these great comic artists to come together and all this. And they thought it would be a great idea to try to find the guy who had this New Orleans folklore collection, Alfred Medley. So he gets out the phone book and proceeds to call all the Medleys in the phone book and actually gets in touch with somebody that knows Alfred Medley. And it turned out to be the brother, I believe. And he asked him about the collection, and he told him, they asked him about the fact that the books were stamped with his name on it. And the brother supposedly responded, well, he was a particular asshole, and hung up.
They said that after Senior died, they called one more time to see if there's any more books available, and they're like, no, everything's done. We got rid of it all, and that was it. So I always assumed that was Alfred who died.
Dear Harry, thanks for asking about my father. Unfortunately, he died from cancer in 1983. These comic books you speak of were actually mine. I found out from my mother that in the early 80s, long after I had grown up, moved out of the city to get a job, and for some reason she was on a radio station being interviewed about one of our church events. And during the course of the interview, she mentioned that she had all of these old comic books lying around the house that her son had left, and she thought they might be collector's items. Lo and behold, she said some guy called her about the comic book. So he came over to the house, browsed through the collection, and bought a few. I don't know which ones he bought, but I know he must have cherry picked,
It's probably Sheldon.
That would be hilarious.
Because that would make sense as Sheldon calling a radio talk show.
Some guy who defaces comic books.
That's definitely Sheldon's sort of modus operandi. Oh, here's a big collection. Okay, I want to buy 5 or 10. Okay, I'm going to come back a couple of days later and buy 5 or 10. Oh, okay, you're going to give me a price, fine, I'll buy it all. I'm a 14-year-old kid, 1981, freshman at De La Salle, sitting around in the cafeteria one day, and a buddy of mine's got the P. Craig Russell Elric comic books, and another buddy of mine had just handed me the first novel like the week before. Like, dude, this is gorgeous. What is this? Where are you getting it? Like, I got it from the comic shop. Where the hell's the comic shop? So after school, we truck on down to Magazine to Sheldon's. Start making the trip there every week. Got to go grab something else. And after a couple of months, hanging out there a good bit after school, he's like, hey, I need an extra pair of hands. I want to do a little bit of work for some comic book credit. So I started doing that. Within the year, I'm running the show.
I used to just get comics from the stores before, just from like Time Saver and stuff like that. But there was a cartoon that was on in the mornings called Robotech. And then a friend of mine told me that they made a Robotech comic book, but you could only get it from specialty stores. So that's how I found Magazine Street Bookshop, otherwise known as Comic Book Heaven. And my mom brought me, they had the Robotech comic books, and I got those, and at first I was gonna get those, and it was like ready to go, and he's like, well, we got a lot of other stuff here, why don't, you might wanna stick around. I was like, yeah, that would be awesome. So then Sheldon actually told my mom, he's safe here. You can, if you got some other stuff to do, you can just leave him, come back. I like to let the kids look through the books and everything else.
But it was pretty ramshackle the way we did everything. I don't remember how we got paid or how we were supposed to get paid, or we sort of took new comic books and then we got a certain amount of cash. It was all kind of on the honor system. I don't really remember what we made or how he paid us or any of that stuff.
I remember the sideburns, and it's sort of like the Penguin, from Batman. A little bit like Grandpa Munster, a little bit,
From a Dungeons and Dragons standpoint, he was like a gnome that was about 6 inches too tall.
He was like a bit of a weirdo, not in a harmful sort of way. He was a short guy. He used to have like a big comb over, and which was never combed over. It was always kind of sticking up. And he had these long, shaggy, sort of lamb chop sideburns. So Rich and I used to call him Shelverine. He lived around the corner. He lived on Marengo, which is a couple blocks away on Magazine Street. And his apartment, it was like a shotgun apartment. It was all just like boxes of old comic books and piles of old books. You know, it was like an extension of the shop. It wasn't like a place a human being would live.
Yeah, by the time you get to like 82 or 83, you know, I'm a junior in high school at this point, yeah, running the shop by myself half the time when Mike and Richard aren't around. I'd be sitting here trying to work, and Sheldon would walk across the street to the pet shop and just hang out all afternoon. It's all about the birds over there, the birds over there. I'm like, dude, Sheldon, I'm a cat person. Birds are hors d'oeuvres. I really don't care. The only way I care about birds is if they got bacon across their back and they're cooked properly. And one day he comes back across the street and he's got all this hardware shit from Harry's Hardware down the street. And he's like, yeah, here, gets this eye hook thing. He's like, here, I want you to put this in the ceiling right there. He points the spot. And half an hour later, he comes back with a cage with that fucking cockatiel in it. Hangs it right over my goddamn chair. Thanks, boss.
Like, that was part of a rite of passage, like, of going to his shop. You had to become friends with the bird, which was okay. I mean, he's a nice bird. He didn't take a crap on me, so I was fine with that.
The bird was annoying as hell, and he used to shit all over the place.
Because while you're trying to have a conversation, there's this parrot that's doing this thing in the background. But you got to keep focused. Of course, the parrot's not a parrot.
That was his thing. No, it's a penguin. It's a penguin, and it's his sense of humor, but he just took it so far. You're dead right. So somebody obstinate, like, say, me. It's like, that's not a penguin, that's an hors d'oeuvre. That's not a penguin, that's a cockatiel. And you'd gainsay him about 3 times on that, and then you'd see it here, like the little red rash, like Gorbachev in the 80s, and just it's like if there were gamma radiation involved, he would have hulked out.
So I can't really speak to what kind of a businessman he was when he did that. I know that when people came into the shop to sell him things, the first thing he would do is he would totally denigrate whatever it was that they had. If they came in with like a stack of Da Vinci, paintings or something, he'd say, well, this is garbage. So he would, sort of browbeat them into like taking as little as possible for this stuff.
So my dad, he was the only one still living at the house at the time. But we found out he had cancer. And I was talking to him on the phone one day, and he mentioned that same guy, he said, that same guy who came over and bought a few comics books from your mom called, and he wanted to buy a few more. Well, at the time, I was trying to go to California. I needed some money. So I had the number. Never met him, just called him up. And he said he wanted to buy a few of the comic books. Will I be willing to sell them, and how much did I want for them? So I said, listen, I want to sell you all of them. So he says, well, how much do you want for them? I said, I want $350. And he said, oh, well, that's kind of plenty. I said, listen, I know you've been in that collection. You know what I have. You know I got collector's items in that. So between that and all the other peripheral comic books I had, I know they're worth a lot of money. I said, that's what I want, $350. I know he was trying to persuade me in the negotiation, but I'm from New Orleans, I know all the tricks. So I called my father back, and I said to him, listen, Daddy, I told him I'd sell them to him for $350, okay? Furthermore, the ticket to California only cost me about $300. So you keep the $50 for the agent fee, He was happy, because he probably never sold nothing in his life, I did have fun in California. What were you doing in California? Well, I had cousins out there. They took me to the beaches. They took me all over. It was my first, maybe my second time going to California. It was bright and sunny. It was the summer, I think. Young ladies out there were very aggressive. You'd be standing on the beach, and some of them would come up and start talking to you. And I'm like, wow, this is not like it back in the South.
The best deal I think I ever got was I bought Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles #1 from Carl Tupper at cover price, and I sold that son of a bitch for $1,500.
Carl was probably the goofiest looking, most ornery, cantankerous guy you would probably ever see in your life. And you fell in love with him immediately because he was so affable and he was so personable. And he was just the sweetest guy most of the time. From what I understand, Carl had a stroke. He was in his early 30s, I think, when he had the stroke. And it was kind of like a therapy thing. He opened the store. And it was basically just used paperbacks that people would come in and trade them 2 for 1.
He had Harlequin paper book romance novels, and he would had tons and tons of them. And middle-aged women would come in and buy books at like 50 cents a book. One of the people I worked for after Carl, A.G. Parr, he and Kirby G, another major person in the comic scene during my time, Richard Ory, they all kind of said, hey, Carl, bring some comics in because you got mothers in here, kids, something kids could do. And you're talking about early 80s, late 70s, early 80s. So it wasn't really, he was like, okay, bring it in, whatever, I don't care. And that ended up becoming his business just by letting 3 people say, hey, this is a good idea. And it changed completely. So Book Swap Incorporated came BSI Comics, and all the paperbacks went away.
Carl was an endearing soul. I never met anybody that disliked him. I met people that were taken back. They didn't know what to think of him in some ways. I think he was an enigma to some people. And in some ways, I think that they were afraid to get to know him. I mean, he did have some facial issues, and he was in a wheelchair, and I think some people pitied him, but I think if anybody would have actually spent any time with that man, they would have realized that he lived a life that most people would have dreamed of. He had kids that he did adore, a wife that I knew very much that he loved. He lived a good life. I mean, he did what he enjoyed. I think things would have been different if he hadn't had the surgery and accident or whatever, but all in all, I think he lived an incredible life. And I think he touched more people than he ever really realized.
Working in a shop, I started, it was 89 when I got employed from Carl Tupper at BSI on the Fairfield location. It was a whole different world. Comics were cheap, and I worked for a cheaper man. So he believed that if he gave us a Coke and $1 an hour, that was enough for the slave labor that we did. But again, we were opening up to a whole new world of, excitement. It was at your hands. And I mean, the man had probably about at least 100,000 comics in that building at all times. So it was an education in retail, customer service, and how to run and how to not run a business. When you're dealing with a man who had a larger than life persona, and he ran a business that way. Carl was probably one of the greatest men I've ever known. He was very complicated. The man was a genius. If he wouldn't have had the tumor in his brain, we wouldn't have BSI. And he was tall in stature. I mean, when he sat in the wheelchair, everybody saw him, he was this little decrepit man. But when he stood up, the man was like 6'3", 6'4". The man had the best swear words, best lines. Probably the one that always sticks to my mind is he used to say, "You could suck the snotty end of my fuck stick, babe," when somebody would just piss him the hell off and he wanted them out of the building.
He was a really nice guy. He was always good to me. I mean, he had this gravelly sort of, voice, but he was a very decent person. And, he was fun to be around. He was a good raconteur. He always had interesting stories to tell and that kind of thing.
I worked for Carl, Cap worked for Carl, Kirby worked for Carl, Richard worked for Carl. Find anybody around the age of 40 to 50 in this town, and I guarantee you in some way, shape, or form, they worked for Carl at some point.
Community. I mean, Carl's shop was all about that. People knew each other. You didn't just go in there to shop. You went in there to hang out. You knew you were going to be there for a few hours. You'd bring your sandwich or your eclair with you. I think it was a prerequisite in New Orleans to have a bakery next door to your comic shop.
He'd probably still be alive. And if Alfred Medley's alive, I want to know who he is. If he's dead, I want to know who he was.
Kind of like a folk hero, folklore, why did this guy do it?
I didn't know anything about him as a person. I knew that Sheldon had bought this collection from somebody. I mean, this was like meta knowledge. I mean, this was like inside comic book shop, super meta geekdom information. I mean, it never occurred to me that anybody would give a crap.
Parts of your letter, I found the music. To think, anybody was actually wondering about me as an urban legend, as you said. The other part was about my dad wheeling and dealing in 1982, when he actually had cancer that year. Didn't leave the house very often. In fact, my sister told me she got her husband to disable his car because she was afraid for him to drive. Sadly, he passed away in 1983. Though I have no idea what I could say after 50 years, my memory is sketchy at best of those actual comic books. Though I remember the Avengers was about Marvel superheroes joining forces to fight threats to our planet or something like that. Iron Man, Thor, the Hulk, Ant-Man. Everyone except Spider-Man was part of that group. I liked the name so much that I got my team members to name our bowling team the Avengers in the 60s. Well, we did win a league championship one year. Not that it mattered at the time, but one of the reasons Alfred Medley Jr. wasn't on the stamp is because I had reached the maximum number of letters that allowed when I bought it. I was living out of town. My father was the only person that whoever that collector was met. We both had the same name, Senior and Junior. I guess over the years they thought it was my father's collection, but I never saw him read a comic book in my whole life.
If there's any Alfred Medley books across this country, probably between me, you, Les, and Kirby. We did shows. We'd go out to Alabama, Mississippi, Tennessee, and we'd have those books in our collections because, we constantly traded them with each other. And the Medleys were like mixed in with all of our stuff, so they went with each other. And then when we started doing shows, they went with us up there. And, I'm sure a lot of the first Medleys that went out of Louisiana came through us. I knew it wasn't a store because I lived in New Orleans. So I would have heard of Alfred Medley. There were only 3 dealers when I started collecting comics down here, and that was pretty much it. So I knew it wasn't Alfred. Now, it could have been like an old 60s store, but no way.
But just to let you know, I've heard of vegetable medleys, sprint medley relays, and a medley of song. But never a store named Alfred Medley.
Sheldon Down on Magazine, we had BSI out in Metairie. Sheldon's was the only one that was uptown. So it was the only one that's in range for an uptown kid with a bike. So I didn't really spend a lot of time at the other ones, but I had a lot of friends that worked at the other stores and such because we'd all go to cons together.
This was where we could talk what we loved and wouldn't get picked on, and it was okay. Even if you disagreed and you thought the person was an idiot, it was valid because that's what they felt. And that's comic shops even nowadays have that kind of feeling that it's okay for me to say what I want in this place because it's family. And that's how I look at comic shops back then.
It's always funny if I go out to BSI with my friends, walk in and Carl's like, "Oh yeah, I got one of Sheldon's way. You coming over here for a real job or something?" And so whenever I'd go over there, Carl would be like 2 feet behind me in the wheelchair the whole time, just kind of giving me semi-good-natured shit.
Carl and Sheldon didn't have any sort of innate rancor for each other. I think Carl thought Sheldon was kind of a weirdo. And, Sheldon, probably thought Carl was a little strange.
I know that they used to have coffee. I want to say it was either Monday or Tuesday. The heart of it was that Richard made these flyers up, and then AG went and took them out and took a staple gun and stapled them to every single telephone pole in front of their stores. Shit, that just pissed them off, man.
There's a science fiction convention. Sheldon, okay, go to the con. Yeah, here, I'll pay your way in. Go to the con. But I'm not wasting money on buying a table or anything. So here's a shitload of business cards. In the middle of the night, just go shove them under the doors of all the rooms and everything. I get to the con and it's like, dude, I'm not doing that. That's stupid. And I'm talking to my friend Staborsky, who worked over for Carl at BSI at the time. He must have mentioned it to Carl because I'm walking through the dealer's room later, and here comes Uncle Carl in his wheelchair. Hey, man, that dipshit tell you to do, like, street team shit, shoving that under the doors and everything. Yeah, he's like, yeah, that's Sheldon. He's just a shithead. Yeah. He's one of the few people I know who dropped more F-bombs than my dad did. And he'd just sit there in his chair, it's like, and here's the finger. And that son of a bitch shouldn't be allowed to operate a business anywhere in Louisiana.
Probably the biggest prank that we ever played on Sheldon, in which Carl conspired with us. In retrospect, it was incredibly cruel, but we thought it was hilarious at the time. And that was, we played an April Fool's joke on Sheldon. Richard and I pretended hilariously that the store had been robbed. And we sort of trashed the front of the store. We took some of the most valuable books off the wall. We made the desk look like it had been rifled through, that kind of thing. And I think Sheldon kept like a checkbook or something in there, which it's got, a checkbook is gone, and that kind of thing. And we recorded the entire thing on a cassette tape recorder. And I was like hiding on top of one of the bookshelves while Richard engaged with him. And I think Richard kept the tape for years. You hear me sort of like giggling on it. But Sheldon freaked out. He ran out of the store and ran down the street to the Hibernia Bank, which was a couple blocks down on Magazine Street to stop all of his checks or something like that. And then when he finally got back and he's like sort of straightening his hair and trying to get his act together, that kind of thing, Carl calls him up and says like, hey, Sheldon, some guy came out here with a whole bunch of books that have your price stickers on them, like really good ones. I just thought you should be aware of it, like that. And so Sheldon was like, and I think it might even have been Carl who said like, April Fools or something. And we had a sign that popped out and everything. And Sheldon was not amused. And Richard and I thought it was hilarious. We listened to the tape for years.
And working for Sheldon was like being in an episode of Monty Python half the time. I mean, you never know what absurdity was going to go on.
I could tell you that I purchased a lot of them from a newsstand that used to be in the 100 block of Royal Street between Canal and Bienville. I bought them on the way home while waiting for the bus. They sold all the latest magazines. They had the Playboys with the little covers on them, hiding. But they also had comic books, and every month, you would get a new issue. At that time, they cost 10 cents when I first started buying them. But then them jokers raised the price to 12. And you can relate to them. I mean, I think originally Peter Parker was a high school student, just like me at the time, girl problems, which all of us could relate to at that age, rejection. And another thing, he was actually, his job was to be a photographer. Now, how he got the shot, the boss didn't really know because he was Spider-Man. He was always on the scene when it happened. And he produced some good pictures of Spider-Man. I wish I had his equipment. And that was another thing. I was always interested in photography. So here's a guy that's a photographer. He's at high school, got a job. I could relate to him, except I couldn't climb walls. I had two reasons for stamping my book. One was because I wanted to distinguish my books from my brother's books, or they may have gotten mixed up as siblings and created some altercations or debates, which is a good word for fight. And a couple of times my parents had a burglar or two at their house, and I'm like, the way they knew they would be burglarized is because I realized, I told my mother, I said, some of my comic books are missing, and I'm not sure what happened to them. And then when she looked around the house, she found other items missing. And I said, oh, wow. Well, you call the police, tell them if they find these guys and they got comic books with my name stamped on them, that's ironclad proof. Every time I bought them, I go home before I'd even read them, I stamp them. Usually in the middle of the book, or either the lightest part of the cover so you can see it. I mean, you know, with colorful characters and comic books, some parts are darker than others and you can't see the stamp. So I always tried to make sure it was in an area where you could actually see the stamp. But that was over 50 years ago. When I would come back to New Orleans, every now and then I would hear someone who had purchased a copy with my name on it. Funny part is, I don't remember who I sold them to because I never met the guy. I talked to him on the phone one time. More than likely, he was the guy with the comic book store, like in the Big Bang Theory TV show.
If he were still alive, I would probably drop him a postcard just for shits and grins. Hey, man, what the hell have you been doing for the past 35 years?
I remember it was much more of a whimper than a bang. I came one day to open the shop in the morning, and my key didn't work. And I thought maybe it was broken, like somebody had messed with the lock. I couldn't figure out what was going on. So I found a payphone and called up Sheldon at his apartment, and I said, Sheldon, my key doesn't work. Somebody must have messed with the lock or something like that. He's like, no, I changed the locks and you don't work there anymore. And I was like, what? And I was just stunned. I didn't understand what was going on. And he wouldn't give me an explanation. I was like, well, why? And he's just like, I don't want to talk about it. You don't work there anymore. I changed the lock. And I'm like, fine.
I remember it vividly. I don't know what started it, but I come into work one day and Sheldon's kind of being pissy and my cat's sort of stomping around in the shop and I'm in the back, you know, kind of organizing things after everybody's picked through because the day before was all the new issues coming in. And I hear raised voices up in the front of the shop, you know, so being a nosy Creole, I wander up the aisle, walk up, and right as I'm getting up to the desk, I see Mike standing there. He just slams down this folder full of comics on the desk. He's like, Sheldon, I mean this from the bottom of my heart. Go fuck yourself. The top of his lungs, yeah. It was like that those old speaker commercials. You can almost see Sheldon's hair blowing back in the wind. Stomp, stomp, stomp out the door down the street and never saw him again.
I don't remember ever speaking to him again. I don't think that I came back and yelled at him. That's not something I would do. That would have been a little... Maybe Richard did. Richard was more of a yeller than I was. I was more the sort of person who'd grit my teeth and stomp off, you know, and quietly hate the person forever.
I would come in every Sunday and fix his computers because Carl bought really bad equipment. And not only did he buy bad equipment, but he constantly screwed it up because he thought he was trying to make it go faster or whatever it was he was trying to do. So I'd pick him up on Sundays. We'd go get some coffee. We'd go get some food and come here and I would just fix his stuff. And I'd browse the rack. And at the time I was out of comics. I'm one of those people that was kind of in and out of comics, you know, as you grow up, you know, just to cover girls or whatever and get out of comics. And then you dump the girls and you get back into comics. And so that's kind of where I was. And so Carl would just give me comics for fixing his computers. And so we were just friends for the longest time. And after Katrina hit, Carl calls me and he says, you know, I don't know, he was asking for something computer related, if I had a copy of something. I said, no, I don't have that, but you know, what's going on with the shop? And he says, well, the shop, you know, took on damage and I'm getting out. And I said, what do you mean you're getting out? He goes, well, the AC unit was torn off the roof and water poured in. And so, you know, it's just too much for me to do. I'm getting too old for this. So I'm out. I've already put in an insurance claim and we're closing the doors. And I said, well, why don't I come pick you up tomorrow and let's go. I want to see how bad it is, you know. So I came in and I saw how bad it was. And there was water and mildew everywhere on the upstairs and, you know, books that were here had been sitting here for months, you know, with water in the shop. So all the covers were warped, you know, from the humidity and stuff. And so I said, you know, what do you think if I might buy the store? You know, and he says, well, you know, you can buy the name from me, but I don't own any of the product. I already put in my claim. I said, all right. So I got the wife to run the numbers and it looked like it was going to be feasible for us to not only buy it, but to be able to make it work. And so one thing led to another and I bought all of the remaining stock from the insurance company and just started running the store.
I would appreciate it if you would send me a Xerox copy of that Avengers comic book cover with my name stamp on it. You have revived old memories that I had really forgotten about. I kind of wonder what happened to the other 899 comics, if any of them still exist. Thanks, Alfred Medley Jr.
Are you ready? To all you strange people out there, we have a question that we're trying to really figure out. We need to know who the hell's Alfred Medley? Who the hell is Alfred Medley?
Who the hell is Alfred Medley? Who the hell is Alfred Medley?
Who the hell is Alfred Medley?
Who the hell is Alfred Medley?
Who the hell is Alfred Medley?
Who the hell is Alfred Medley?
Who the hell is Alfred Medley? Who the hell is Alfred Medley?
I'm the hell Alfred Medley.